everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing my March wrap-up. This was a great month. I read some great books this month, some new favorites, and I'm so excited for the start of this year's new fantasy bingo. I had a really good time doing it last year. It was the first time I had done r/fantasy bingo, and I had a really great time. I also participated in the r/female gaze SFF summer seasonal reading challenges. They do a shorter reading challenge every 6 months, and I really like those too. They're really chill about it, and it's a lot more lenient. You can reread, you can repeat authors, stuff like that. And again, because it's a shorter challenge, the prompts themselves are shorter, and there's a mix and match of cards you can do. You can do as much or as little of a card as you want. I typically just go for the completionist angle because that's the kind of person I am, but I really enjoy those prompts as well, and those are a little bit more female focused, so I definitely do enjoy those prompts. Let's get into what you're actually here for, the March wrap up. So first let's go over my stats, and then we will go over the books I want to talk about. So in March I read 31 books. 18 of those were from the library, 9 of those were digital, and I believe 4 of those I read on my phone, and 3 of them I read on my Kobo. 1 book I got was from Kobo Plus, and 4 of them were books I physically owned. 2 of these are library books that I just happen to have when I'm still filming this video, because I finished reading them a couple days ago, and I haven't been back to the library since. So let's talk a little bit more about my stats. Okay, so I read 81% fiction and 19% nonfiction this month. We're doing it. We're keeping it above a 10%. We might even be able to get an average of 20% by the end of the year, which is great. I know we're only 3 or 4 months in, but I think I can do it. I think I might be able to do it. And the more I have really focused on reading nonfiction, the more I have been able to find nonfiction books that appeal to me and that I just want to pick up and read. So I think it's definitely helping, and it's definitely helping me get back into that mindset where I want to be reading nonfiction and I want to be picking those kinds of books up. So that has been going great. My top genres were fantasy, LGBT, sci-fi, horror, and romance. And then I think classics was right underneath that. So again, very average for me. 77% books I read in print, mostly from the library. 23% of books I read digitally. I read a lot of ARCs this month on my phone, so that's again a big part of that. My average rating was 3.78. I read a lot of really good books that I rated really highly this month, but I also read a lot of ARCs that I thought were just okay, or that I liked but I had problems with, so that's where that rating is coming from. My highest rated works were Works of Vermin and Leech, both from higher end MAs, and I gave Works of Vermin a 5 and Leech a 4.5, although I'm really considering bumping that up because I really did love that book and I thought it was really well constructed and crafted. I just personally felt more emotionally connected to Works of Vermin. It's nothing's stopping me from giving them both a 5, even though I liked Works of Vermin a little bit more. I don't know, maybe I'll bump it up to a 4.75 or just give it a 5, but those were my 2 highest rated books. And let's start, I guess, by talking about the ARCs I read in March. First of all, I read Fishbone Cinderella by Elizabeth Lim. This was actually the first book I read in March. I've never read Elizabeth Lim before. I know she's a pretty popular YA fantasy author. She's written, I think, 6 Crimson Cranes or something like that. She's written a couple, or Spin the Dawn, some stuff like that I know is pretty popular in the YA fantasy spaces, especially people who read a lot of East Asian inspired fantasy lit. I don't read a lot of YA, so I haven't read anything from her, but Fishbone Cinderella made me consider picking some of her other stuff up because I really enjoyed it. This story, it's vaguely magical realism, but it's really more of a historical fiction story about a mother and a daughter. At the beginning of the book, they're on this plane heading back to Hong Kong. Marigold is the daughter, and Helen/Yut Ying is the mother. Yut Ying was raised in Hong Kong, in mainland China, and then in Hong Kong, and Marigold, her daughter, was raised in the United States, and they're going back to Hong Kong after a very long time, and then we get Yut Ying's backstory and her extremely traumatic and hard life growing up in war-torn China and being sent to live with her abusive father and stepmother when her village is decimated, and her experiences in Hong Kong and as she eventually came to America. And it's kind of interspersed with chapters of her and Marigold on the plane, and then far into the book we start to actually get Marigold's backstory, and then Marigold starts to piece together her mother's life and this family curse that has been lingering over the family and how to solve that. This is kind of a Cinderella retelling and kind of a story about a woman who can turn invisible and her daughter who can like feel sensory impressions from objects. But really it's a story about generational trauma and especially the relationship between mothers and daughters. And I really enjoyed those aspects of the book. I did think that Ying's perspective was so much more interesting than Marigold's just because of the kind of geographical and temporal ground we were covering in hers. We cover so much of her life and she is constantly like moving around and experiencing these really tough, interesting things, whereas Marigold is kind of just like a very basic YA coming of age story, and I really didn't like the romance in that section. It's not like, this isn't a romance book, it's not a huge part of the story, but like it's this classic like she falls in love with this guy but she's mean to him because she doesn't know how to deal with it, and he picks on her because he has a crush on her and doesn't know how to deal with it, and then they find each other again in college and start dating, but oh no, like her parents don't accept that he's Japanese and she's Chinese, and obviously the Japanese did a lot of horrible shit to China, so they don't accept of it. It was just not very interesting to me. But once we get further into Marigold's perspective and we do start to get her like sleuthing out her mom's backstory and like what happened to her mom and how to like solve this family curse, then her perspective got a lot more interesting to me. And I think maybe like one of the themes of the story is supposed to be that mothers suffer so that their daughters have an easier life, but it just didn't make Marigold's story any more interesting to read about. But overall, I really enjoyed this story. It has a very beautiful writing style that doesn't tip over into overly lyrical for me. It's just kind of a very beautiful way of telling this story. It deals with a lot of incredibly dark topics like child abuse and death and, you know, growing up in a war-torn country, famine, sexual harassment, stuff like that. But it does it in a way that treats these topics with the right amount of gravity and seriousness, but also isn't super overly dark or like tragedy porn. Sorry, my cat is like trying to climb into my iced coffee. No, not for you. I really recommend this when it comes out, I think in like May. I'll double check that and put the date up on the screen. And yeah, this has made me again want to check out more of Elizabeth Lim's work, even though it's not a genre I typically gravitate towards. So I really liked this. Another arc I read was The Ship of Death by Kyle Winkler. I requested this one because the concept was so fun. It's this mixed media story about this couple who beta test tabletop role-playing games, and they get this game called The Ship of Death, and it slowly starts to like take over their lives and seemingly start to impact reality. And it's kind of the story of how they both fall deeper and deeper into this game and, you know, can't tell the difference between the game and reality. I really liked the concept, and I thought certain parts of this book were really fun and inventive, and I really liked the discussions around like ludology, the study of games, and like why people play games and why they enjoy games. But this story's a little bit messy. I still had a good time, but your mileage may vary. If the concept sounds interesting to you, I would recommend picking it up. It's so short. I do hope that it goes through a couple more rounds of proofreading before it's published, I believe in September, because this one had like a typo or like some sort of spacing or punctuation error on like literally every single page, and normally by the time books get to NetGalley, they've been pretty thoroughly copy edited and I barely see like typos. Like maybe I'll see one punctuation error or spacing error in an entire like 400-page book, but this one again literally had one on probably every page or every couple of pages. So I really hope that it goes through a couple rounds of editing before it gets published, but I still did enjoy it. I did think that this felt a little bit male gazy, despite the fact that it's about a married couple, and honestly the wife, the woman person in this couple, has a more interesting story than the man, than her husband, but she is kind of treated as a secondary character, and there's again certain little things that just make you aware that the story is written by a man. Like they're going to the wife is going to therapy, and like we see her therapist notes, and in the notes her therapist has written down that like Lorraine, the wife, has been like complaining about the fact that she takes on the majority of like domestic labor in their house, despite the fact that they both work full-time. And the therapist in her notes like basically calls her overreacting and writes down that from what like Lorraine's told me, I think that they share an equal amount of domestic labor, and like just stuff like that where it's like, first of all, I don't think a therapist would ever say that about a client, and second of all, that felt so like male gaze wish fulfillment-y, where it's like, oh, my wife complains that like, you know, she is doing the majority of the domestic labor, but really I help her out so much because I'm such a good person and I'm such a good guy like that. So anyways, overall I did like this. It was fun, but a little bit messy. Another arc I read was As the Snow Gathers by Mir Joyce. I also liked this one. This is kind of like a dark horror gay romance, kind of. The relationship is already established by the time the book starts, and it's about these two boys, young men I guess, who live in this isolated Canadian mining town, and the town has been like menaced by these mysterious forest creatures for like years and years and years, but the creatures have never actually done anything to them until now. Like, the further the miners, the loggers move into the forest, the more the creatures have like actually started to mess with the villagers. Like, at first it was just that they would take dead bodies, drain them of blood, and then return them. So like creepy and scary, but like not actually that harmful, not really doing anything. But now they're like actively attacking the townspeople. And so it's about these two boys, one of them's minor, one of them's like the town doctor after his father died, and it's about them facing both the scrutiny of the village, the townspeople, because they suspect they're in a gay relationship and it's like the 1800s, and also the trying to figure out what this encroaching threat is upon the town and how they can save themselves. It drags a little bit in the middle, but I felt like it made up for it with a very explosive ending. The relationship is sweet. You are rooting for those boys. It does kind of a clever subversion of like bury your gays, not to spoil anything, but it like the relationship itself has like a happy ending, and you know that the boy, not like a happy ending, but like a bittersweet ending, and they both make it out and are still together at the end, and like kind of vow to get their revenge on the people who like tried to hurt them. So but not in the way you think. So I enjoyed that part. I feel like what really kept me from loving this book and like really wholeheartedly recommending it is I only gave it like a 3.75 or a 3.5. And the reason for that is like I just like did not like the writing style here. It's a very like telling character who is hyper aware. They're like narrating a novel kind of writing style, and it feels like there's like a narrative framework of like the character writing a diary or writing letters, because the character's like talking directly to the audience at a lot of times and like just telling the audience how he's feeling and like what is happening, but there is none of that like actual narrative framework to justify that writing style. And so for me it just felt a little bit awkward and a little bit like I couldn't really connect to the character or what he was feeling, because he was just like telling us everything that he was feeling. There's also some moments where the prose just got like absolutely insane in a bad way. Like my favorite line from this is probably the melody of their tongues mingled in the candlelit glow. It's like, what, even as a metaphor, that makes no sense. How are your tongues emitting melodies, and why, like, what? But overall, I did like this one. I think if you, again, like, you know, creepy, gays in the creepy woods, like this is a good one. I recommend picking it up when it comes out again, and I think September. I also read The Secret World of Briar Rose by Cindy Pham, and this is a YA fantasy book. I picked this up on NetGalley because it was listed as like download now, so like anybody could download it, you didn't have to request it. The cover was beautiful. It had a really interesting concept. It's like a Sleeping Beauty retelling focusing on a lesbian relationship, but also on like sleeping as suicide ideation, which I thought was really interesting. And I've never watched, apparently this is a YouTuber, it says it in the like synopsis when you're downloading the book on NetGalley. I have never watched her videos. I didn't know anything about her. I was just going into it like completely blind with like no expectations at all beyond this concept is cool and this cover is beautiful. I don't read a lot of YA fantasy, but like it can always change my mind. Like I liked the Elizabeth Lim stuff, and I feel like that does lean a little bit younger. I didn't really like this one. I didn't like this one at all. I think some of this is just due to taste. I feel like at first when I was reading this book, I was like, I don't really love this, but I think that people who like very lyrical, whimsical YA fantasy, like the new Roshani Chokshi book or like the Sulin Tan books, will like this. Like that's the kind of audience it's going for, and I think it's doing what it's doing well. It's just not something that I enjoy, so like, you know, it's on me. The further this book went on though, the more I was like, this is kind of just badly written, and not in ways that you can just chalk up to being like me having too high expectations because I'm a 24-year-old woman and this is written for teenagers. It just like started to get real poorly paced and poorly plotted, and there's 3 things going on in this book that make it unique and that could be a draw for me. There's the Sleeping Beauty retelling focusing on suicide ideation, there is the lesbian romance, and there is the kind of dual timelines of the princess's timeline like 100 years in the past and the modern day timeline, I don't know when this book is supposed to be set in, and the present day timeline of Corin in the present and her going through dreamland and stuff like that with Aurora the princess. It's Amelia with Amelia the princess. And I don't think any of these aspects really worked or were really well done. First of all, I love a lesbian romance, especially in fantasy. It's so easy to get me with that. But I thought this one was just really poorly paced and poorly developed. The two characters don't spend a lot of time together, and they're kind of off on separate side quests for the majority of this book, and then they speed run development from like Corin not liking Amelia and thinking that she doesn't know anything that, you know, Corin has been through, to, oh my god, I relate to her so much, we have the same trauma, like, let's be friends, to, oh my god, I'm totally in love with her. Like, this switch happens so rapidly, and by the time it like decides to be a romance, we have so little of the book left that it really has to speed run that romantic development and just rely on a lot of cliches and like really tired dialogue, like hints that these characters are in love now, that I just didn't think worked for me. Like, there is literally a scene in this where the characters are looking at the sunset or the sky or whatever, and Amelia goes like, oh, it's so beautiful, and Corinne is like, yeah, it is, and the dialogue text, like, she said, looking at Amelia, and it's like, you haven't earned that. You really haven't earned that level of cheesiness when you haven't done anything to show us that these characters have grown to really actually like each other through their actions and their words and their interactions with each other. I'm sorry. Again, this is me being a jaded old lady, but like, I don't believe it. It made me cringe. It didn't make me like be like, oh my god, they're so cute, they're so in love. I just couldn't believe it. I actually felt like both of the characters had a way more interesting relationship with Malicene the demon than they did with each other, and I wish that this had almost been like a found family, like platonic bond kind of story, because that's what it felt like it was going for with Malicene and Amelia and Malicene and Corin, and I really liked both those relationships, and seeing that develop and seeing Malicene go from like this very jaded figure who's like, I don't need anyone, like nobody loves me, to I would kind of die for these like teen girls that I'm taking care of. And also it's really funny that like Malicene is never ever referred to anything other than they them pronouns in the book, and I see people in the Storygraph reviews using every single other pronoun but they them. It's like, guys, this isn't hard. It's quite obvious. But anyways, so I didn't really love the romance. Secondly, we have this dual timeline thing. And I felt like the book was trying to have this very whimsical feeling, journey through dreamland, Alice in Wonderland kind of absurdity, funness to it. But because we are constantly switching back and forth between these timelines, seemingly at very arbitrary points, you can never really get into the flow of that, like just being swept up in exploring dreamland. You're constantly being jarred out of it because we got to go back 100 years in the past and go to Amelia being extremely suicidal and hating her life again. And that just like really, I think, broke the flow of the story and broke the tone that the story was going for. It also felt like because of this kind of split in narrative, the past timeline was interesting but not satisfying, and the present timeline was not interesting but satisfying. Like, we know how the past timeline is going to happen because Corin is from the present and like has heard stories about what has happened. Like, we know that's going to be slightly different because of the whole concept of like narrative and who gets to tell a story, but like we already know that like Amelia is going to make a bond with this person, and then this person is going to die and be portrayed as like this horrible betrayer. So like we know that probably like that didn't happen, but we know from the beginning that this relationship is doomed. So even though I felt like the relationship development in the past timeline was way more interesting and way more tragic because we actually got to see these characters meet each other and then slowly like see that tragedy really happen, I wasn't really like on the edge of my seat watching this happen because I already knew it was going to happen. And then in the present day timeline, the plot is honestly very boring and very like, okay, and now we're going from place to place and experiencing these trippy dreams, but it feels like nothing is ever really going to happen. But then you don't know what's going to happen, so you're like, okay, let me keep reading so that I know like where we're going to end up with this. And then the way it ends up is actually quite interesting plot-wise. But that leads me to my third point, which is the inclusion of suicide is a really big theme of this book, suicide and depression. And huge trigger warning for me, I'm gonna be talking about suicide and depression in general, not in like super explicit detail, but just like talking about suicide and depression. So if that's gonna bother you, I fast forward a couple minutes. And I am trying to be like really generous here because I know that I've seen other people talking in the Storygraph reviews about how this was like a very personal story for the author, and like how they have talked about how this is inspired by their own experiences with suicide ideation. And I really feel for that, I really do, but it's like the plot of this book, the ending of the plot of this book, while I think as a plot it was satisfying and interesting, I think it kind of totally wrecks any of the story's themes around suicide and suicide ideation. It is frankly irresponsible in my opinion. I think we have these two characters who are suicidal. Amelia is the Sleeping Beauty type character, and she basically just wants to go to sleep and never wake up and stay in dreamland because she can't deal with her real life where she feels so disempowered and so unimportant. And I felt like her arc was actually done very well, where slowly throughout the story she comes to realize that she has to wake up and affect her own life and live in her own life and be present in her own life again, and she chooses to do so in a moment that feels quite empowering. the other character, Corin, throughout the whole story, it felt like her pain and her trauma and her depression and suicidality was never adequately addressed. We just start the story already knowing that she has all of this trauma from her parents dying in war and trying to take care of her little sister as like war orphans and meeting this other group of people, then all of them also dying horribly, and then the kind of plot twist that comes in halfway through the book that a character you think was alive has actually been dead this whole time. And it just felt like she kept getting trauma piled on her and never was able to deal with that trauma adequately, or like decide that despite the pain she still wanted to live and have a good life. In the end, she heroically sacrifices herself for Amelia so that Amelia can, like, you know, go back into her timeline 100 years ago. And this to me felt like her just like committing suicide and deciding she didn't want to live anymore, but having the narrative frame it as like a positive, worthwhile sacrifice for somebody else. She chooses to die, but she does it in service of somebody else, so it's okay. And I didn't love that messaging. And then also, when Amelia goes back into her timeline 100 years ago, she is able to change the course of history essentially, so that their countries never went to war, which means that Corin's parents never died. Her family, she grew up with a happy, loving family, and none of her other tragedy ever happened to her. So she is able to live like a nice life, and she sort of has memories of that other life she lived, but they start to fade, and then she just lives a very normal, nice, happy life. I thought this was just like horrifically bad messaging around like depression and PTSD and trauma, because what is this saying? This is saying that sometimes your trauma can be so bad and so horrible that the only way to actually heal from it and get over it is to go back in time and make it so that none of that had ever happened in the first place. I just thought that was really irresponsible and a really bad message to send. And like, I don't think you always need to have like the perfect, most healthy message in your book, but I do think that when it's a YA novel and you're talking about such topics as serious as depression and suicide, I do think you kind of have to be careful around your messaging. And I don't think the right messaging for this book was heroically sacrifice yourself for others and then, you know, magically erase your trauma and decide to live again. Like, it just, it did not work. Again, as a plot, I don't think it's that bad of a story, of a structure, but as a theme of this book, I just thought that this was really bad, that this was really badly done and badly executed. And again, it's so interesting to me because I go through the storygraphers and I see so many people talking about how that was their favorite part of the book, the messaging around depression and suicide, and how like you can live in another life and you can find beauty and joy in your life despite your trauma. I'm like, did we read the same book? Because Corin's arc is all about how she couldn't do that. She couldn't live her life with trauma. She had to have it completely erased. Like, I don't know, am I just interpreting this book the wrong way? Because the difference in the way I felt about the way that suicide and suicide ideation was handled in this plot and the way that other people seem to be taking it is just so wide. And I'm just not sure if, again, that's because I'm not the target audience. I'm a little bit older than I think a lot of people, the other people reviewing this book are, and I have had time from my own period of being like an angsty teen and having those same feelings that I'm like, I don't know, like, you do have to live with your trauma. You do have to live with horrible things happening to you, and it's really hard. And it is not as easy as just going back in time and snapping your fingers and making it so that you did have a wonderful life with a support system. Sometimes you don't have those things and you don't get that magic wand waved. No one ever does, because this isn't a fantasy world. So I don't know. It just was not the best message. Again, I think maybe you might have a better time with this if you are more in the age range of like liking YA fantasy, or, you know, even if you're an adult who likes YA fantasy. But for me, yeah, I did not like this one bit. I also got an arc of Daggerbound by T. Kingfisher, which is the next book in the Sword Heart series. The first book in this, I feel like, came out quite a bit ago. I remember reading it and being like, it feels like we're really setting up for like more books where the other swords people come into play, but it's been so long since this book was published, I guess she decided not to do it. But surprise, surprise, they are still coming. And I got an arc of this one. I was really excited to read this one because it is gay. You know, that's a little piece of cheese in my mousetrap. And I enjoyed this one. I'm not the hugest T. Kingfisher fan, but I think that this is definitely the way to go. Just read like one of her books every couple of months, and that way I don't get like information overload. It also helps that I felt like the couple in this book was a little bit different from other couples, not just in the sense that they were both men, but in the sense that they were a little bit like the romantic lead was a little bit more funny and charming than her leads usually are. They're usually, I feel like, very like kind of awkward and buttoned up, and like you know, don't really know how to talk to women, but this guy was very flirty and suave. And then the lead, the like narrator of the book, the primary narrator, was less quirky, millennial, chatty, socially awkward, and more like smart, shy, sheltered. And I found that difference in dynamic to be pretty interesting and, you know, a little bit different than her normal stuff. So I enjoyed that. I also feel like the side characters in this one were really fun. I loved the two major side characters, Dog Violet the Knoll and Large Francis, the giant pill bug that talks with a music box. Like, that was so fun. I loved that character. And the plot of this one is pretty interesting. And yeah, I think we'll read the third one when it comes out. It's going to be about Ankarad. And I know T. Kingfisher's not going to make her a lesbian, but I would like that. I feel like it would be nice and different. Something I also think was funny in this book was in her male-female romances, they get like pages upon pages of sex scenes, like quite explicit ones, even in her traditionally published books. I feel like it's a little bit more explicit in her self-published books, but I went back and looked at Sword Heart and it was still pretty explicit, like open door, subtle, like one scene, but pretty obvious what was going on. And in both of her gay romances, it's been like, and now a fade to black hand job, and that's all we're getting. And I'm not saying she has to write gay sex if she doesn't want to, but it is just something I've noticed, and it is kind of funny. Like, I would rather, again, if she's not comfortable doing it, if she feels like she can't portray it accurately, that is totally fine. I'm not saying she's problematic for this or anything, but it's just a pattern I've noticed, and it does make me laugh. Also, I feel like the humor in this one was less cringeworthy than it usually is in T. Kingfisher books for me. Maybe, again, because of the fact that it's traditionally published, not self-published, and maybe had somebody reining her in on some of her worst impulses. There is a bit in this book that made me actually roll my eyes when T. Kingfisher basically lifts the bit about, like, manslaughter, the common joke about manslaughter that, like, it sounds way worse than murder, but it's technically, like, less bad. That I feel like this joke originated on Tumblr, but, like, is really everywhere on the internet. And she basically lifts that joke wholesale and, like, just puts it in this book. And that, I think, was pretty lazy and not funny, because I've already seen this joke a billion times. So I don't know. That was the one joke I didn't like in this book. But other than that, it was fine. I had a good time with this. I definitely recommend it when it comes out. And I think if you liked the first book, you'll definitely like this one. It's just more of the same. Very fun. And then the last arc I read, I'm not going to talk about it right now. I'm going to talk about it later when I talk about a different book, because it is the sequel to that book. So, okay, I'm going to talk about now The Poet Empress by Shen Tao. This is a adult fantasy debut novel that has really taken the internet by storm. A lot of people really loved this book. A lot of people had more middling opinions on it. And I think I'm probably in the camp that just found this meh. I feel like since I've read this, I've seen a lot of really great reviews that bring up critiques that I definitely agree with. But at the time when I read this, I just kind of came away from it feeling like it was an objectively finely written story. I just didn't feel emotionally connected to it. And I still kind of feel like that. And I feel like that was for a couple reasons. And these are my major critiques. That the book is marketed as adult. And it is adult in the sense that it deals with a lot of violence and torture and very tough topics. But I often felt like the way that it dealt with those tough topics felt a little bit more YA. I feel like we really slowly got into the more like serious topics like sexual abuse, especially child sexual abuse. It very slowly worked our way over there. And the majority of the adult content shown was like people murdering each other, which is like, again, adult, but like not super actually affecting, in my opinion. Like, I don't know, gore and violence in books just doesn't really do anything to me, especially in the context of this where it's like so brushed over. It's just like, and then he murdered all the servants and I came across the housekeeper with a blade in her gut, and it's like, that's really horrific in the context of the story, but like as a reader that doesn't do much for me. But anyways, it slowly works our way up to those dark topics, and then also it couldn't help itself and just like kept having to have the main character, not even the narration, have the main character out loud, like say the themes of the book and say the kind of thematic conclusion she had come to. And I didn't feel like that was necessary, because I felt like the author actually really like showed those things and showed that, you know, people are their circumstances and they're not born monsters, they become monsters via their circumstances by the things that her name's Wei, right? I think so. The things that she had been learning throughout the book and the kind of conclusions that she had been coming to in her head. She literally says it out loud to like the ghost of the boy that Taryn once was. And it's like, I just don't think that scene was necessary. And I think it again tips over into just a little bit too YA for me, like feeling like you need to borderline blatantly state the themes of the novel or else like people aren't going to get what you're going for. Like, you didn't need to do that. I always feel like it's better to have restraint, and it's better to kind of like let the words and the actions speak for themselves. And that's just me, I think, especially my perspective as like an actor, because as an actor, that sounds so pretentious, as somebody who did acting when I was younger, like I always think I love reading scripts and then seeing how they take out lines because the actors can portray the exact same line with their face, with just their like facial expressions. I love that, and I think that that's really, you can do that in books too. You can take away lines and just have things be portrayed by what the characters are doing and what they're not saying, and I love that, and that was very not present in this book. And then also the very happy, like kind of insanely like fluffy happy ending to this book, where like despite everything she's been through, the main character comes out of it the other side like very in control of her destiny and like not super changed in a bad way or a positive way, just kind of the same character she's always been, and like it totally changes history and is able to let women be literate and fixes everything in this ancient China fantasy, ancient China allegory. It felt, again, a little YA, where it's like, and now after all this torture, let's give them a happy ending so that people don't come away from this book too sad. I really would have loved a more bittersweet ending. Like maybe she goes back to her village to live in her village, but like she feels like they can never truly understand her because of all the things that she's done to save the village. But no, instead she stays at the palace and like becomes the poet empress and like has all this and seems pretty cool with it. So I don't know. That was the stuff that I felt like led to this book feeling, again, a little bit more YA, despite the fact that it is an adult book, it's marketed as an adult book, and that is also what led to me having a little bit, I think, of an emotional distance from it. A lot of this book is also flashbacks and like getting the same story from different people to like show how different people have different memories and different motivations and like recollections of the same events happening. And while I think that's interesting in theory, in practice it just didn't do a lot for me, and it meant that I was constantly kind of putting down the book when we got to like a natural stopping point when we were like entering into a new memory, and I just felt really no desire to pick it back up. I was like, I don't know, I just don't really, again, I'm not really emotionally invested in this book or in these characters. I feel like, again, other people since then have brought up really good points, like the fact that despite this being kind of like a feminist book about this female character being brutalized by a man and like saving women, it's really more about the male character than it is about her, and we learn way more about the male character, and he goes through way more development than she does, and at the end of the book it kind of just ends up feeling like she has been this side player in his story, when the whole point of the book is that she's the one in control of her own destiny. So I do agree with that point. But yeah, I didn't think this book was bad at all, and I actually really liked the writing descriptions. I felt like, again, the writing style kept me kind of at a remove, but the descriptions of like, you know, fantasy ancient China were very beautiful. And then I also thought the magic system was interesting. I know some people have complained that like it's a book about magic poetry, but there's not actually a lot of poetry in it. In fact, we don't even really get to see Wei's like magic poem at the end. We just like see the title of it, and I didn't really mind that because I would rather have an author just sidestep that than write really bad poetry that is supposed to be really good poetry. I hate that in books when a character's like, and now here's the most beautiful poetry we'd all ever heard, and it's like the worst poetry you've ever read in your life because the author's not a poet, they're a novelist. Like it's okay to not do both. But I didn't mind that. I just thought the magic system was really cool, and I wish there were more books discussing ancient Chinese poetry, because Chinese poetry is such a long and storied history and it's such an interesting topic, but I feel like not a lot of books about Chinese history really, or like fantasy books inspired by East Asian cultures, really take that into account, which I thought this book was interesting that it did. So there's that. And then I wanted to read some slop. So I read Warrior Princess Assassin by Bridget Kemmerer. This, finally, romantasy slop for me. I should have picked up this book for my romantasy reading log video, because this is true romantasy, like where the romance is the plot and the plot is kind of secondary. And I actually really enjoyed this because it's about a throuple, and I love throuples. I love thruples, and I love when everybody in the throuple is obsessed with each other, where it's not just like two people and their shared girlfriend or shared boyfriend or whatever, but when every single person in the throuple is equally obsessed with every other member. Challenger says hello. And that is the case in this book. They're all obsessed with each other, and in fact, even what I really liked was that there are these two characters in the throuple who are like childhood friends and like grew up knowing each other and already are kind of interested in each other, but you can tell that like they would never have gone together had it not been for this third party, or if they had gotten together it would have crashed and burned because they did not have the tools necessary to understand each other without this other guy entering the picture, and I really liked that. I also feel like, again, this dealt a little bit like with PTSD and trauma and the way that impacts your relationships with other people, not just like your romantic partners, but just like how you see the world in general. And I thought that was interesting and pretty well done for, like, again, a romantasy book that is really not focused on that. And yeah, everybody had a good time, even in the sex scenes, and I liked that. I did feel like the world building and like the political intrigue was not the greatest fleshed out, but again, that's not really what I'm coming to this series from. So I was like, maybe it'll get, you know, more developed in the sequel. And I went on NetGalley every day. I went on NetGalley every day, typing in the sequel name, seeing if it was available yet, and finally it became available, and I requested it, and a week later I got it, and I read it. So that's my last arc that I have to talk about. It is called Captive Traitor King, also by Bridget Kemmerer. This is the second book in the series. I think it's going to be a trilogy. It gives trilogy vibes, in the sense that nothing happens in this book plot-wise, but there is a lot of character development and relationship development, and so I had a good time, even though I was like, literally nothing has happened in this book. I had a good time anyways. I don't really care. I did feel like the interpersonal conflicts in this one were more annoying. Like in the first book, they're all kind of getting to know each other, and the interpersonal conflict is that they like don't really trust each other because they've all just met. In this book, the interpersonal conflict is that Jory, the princess, like always wants to do some fuck shit. Like she always wants to go do some really dangerous, stupid shit. And her best friend, the assassin Archer, like always throw a temper tantrum when the warrior Kai is like, actually, like, you can't do that, like we need to wait and like get more information before we do that, and that's kind of like, you know, a reckless idea. You're gonna put yourself and all our soldiers in danger. And they throw a fit at him being like, not right now. And this happens like multiple times. I feel like if this had just happened once and like then, you know, everybody had like come to terms about like what, you know, the balance of power was in the relationship, that would be one thing. This happens multiple times, and every time like Jory is portrayed as in the right and portrayed as like an independent, capable girl boss who Kai should just like trust and let her do whatever she wants, even though within the context of the story, she is explicitly like a very sheltered princess who never brought up to know like statecraft and politics and like war. So it's like, why are we expecting to just let her do whatever she wants, and like saying that this other guy is in the wrong for like trying to be like, all right, like I don't want to like hold you back and like keep you prisoner here, but like it's been 3 days. Like, yeah, I haven't rushed off to assassinate your brother yet. Like, can we wait a minute? But other than that, annoying interpersonal conflict, once we got to just like them being a power throuple, it was very fun. Again, we focus a lot more on Archer in this book and his like insanely traumatic backstory. We get a lot of heard comfort with him. It's like catnip to me. I love it. I guess the major plot reveal of this book pretty early on, you're dropping this little hint of information. I'm like, okay, obviously this is what's happening, but there are still like twists and turns near the end of the story that I didn't expect, that I didn't see coming, that were very fun, that set the story up for like a very explosive, what I'm assuming is going to be like the last book in a trilogy. So more of the same, very fun, had a good time with this. And the world building and the political situation do get a little bit more built out in this book. Again, it's still not amazing, but like it's a little bit more fleshed out in this one. So okay, let's talk about some of the classics I read. And I have these 3 books. So I read A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf. I really enjoyed this. This is like a written down version of like a speech she gave at a women's college about kind of digging into the economic reasons why there aren't more great female novelists throughout history, and really talking about how for the vast majority of history women have not had either free time because they were child minders and, you know, domestic laborers, or the economic situations to write, to sit down and write. And also the concept of like how society at large is indifferent to male novelists. You know, that can be sort of a crushing thing to realize, like nobody cares about your next great work of literature, but it is actively scornful to female novelists and shaming female novelists. So that can also be a really big part of it. So much of this is still relevant and still feels like very prescient feminist critique. I did feel like there is, again, because of the time period this was written in, quite a lot of white privilege in this book, and then also a little bit of classism that I did feel like flattened the feminist critique a little bit. It wasn't quite as deep as it could have gone, but overall, again, still very relevant and still a very good feminist critique, and I think this book is really pretty. So I'm happy with that. And then I also read The Touchstone by Edith Wharton. This is her first novel, and it's a little novel about a man who had this like unrequited love affair with this famous female novelist who has recently died, and he is kind of in a financial pickle. He wants to marry this lady, but he doesn't have any money, and so he sells the letters that this woman sent to him, these letters of unrequited love that she sent to him, and gets a lot of money, but basically like loses his soul in the process. It was a very cruel thing that he did, and he redacted his own name and left out his own responses, but basically put this woman's soul out there unconsensually without her permission for everybody to laugh and make fun of her. And this kind of destroys his own sense of self-worth because he cannot admit, he knows he did something wrong, but he can't really admit it to himself. It impacts his relationship with his wife as she like finds out and then like kind of can't really acknowledge it and give him what he wants by like yelling at him and making it his fault. Like he knows that he did something wrong, but she can't be the one to tell him. and he just like totally falls from grace in his own opinion and in the opinion of his wife, and I really enjoyed that. I did think that this takes kind of a sad left turn at the end, where it kind of states that he was actually in the right to sell the letters, and his wife forgives him, and everybody forgives him, and is like, you know, he actually did a good thing for that lady. Like, it built character by being in unrequited love with her, and then, you know, gave her the gift of love, like stuff like that. It's like, I don't know if that's, I don't know if I agree with that. But the introduction of this book and then the kind of epilogue from Cynthia Griffin Wolfe was really interesting and very illuminating on like why that ending happens the way it does, or especially writing about like women's struggles in this time period and why Edith Wharton herself, with her history, would have ended the novel this way. So that was really interesting. And I also did think this just had beautiful, beautiful prose. The Virginia Woolf one had really beautiful prose too, and this one also, I was just like underlining so many lines and thought it was really good. So I definitely want to read The Age of Innocence now, which I have always kind of been interested in, but has always put off because it's a little long for my interest in it. But now I'm way more interested in reading it. So I did really like this one. And then I also read Where Angels Fear to Tread by E.M. Forster. Look at this beautiful cover. This is his first novel, I believe, his first published novel. And I have read a couple of E.M. Forster's novels. I've read A Room with a View and Morris, and I have loved both of those. And this one was no different. I thought this was like hilariously funny in really understated ways. And I'm typically not like a, you know, Victorian humor kind of person, but this was hilarious in very understated ways. The funniest book about baby murder I've ever read. I don't know if I want to spoil that because I was so gagged when I got to the end of this book and the baby died, and I was like, what? I ended this book, I was like, what the fuck? But really great critique of English social norms and the hypocrisy and snobbery of Edwardian England as the back states, and also, again, just really, really funny and great prose. So, okay, and then I read another Melissa Scott book. I read Night Sky Mine by Melissa Scott. I got this one from the library, and I read the first chapter of this book and then put it down for like 2 weeks. And I kept renewing it and kept renewing it and kept not reading it and then renewing it, and eventually I was like, I have to just like bring this into work, read as much as I can, and then either give it back to the library or like commit to reading it. So I brought it to work, I read the second chapter, and I was immediately hooked. I maintain that the first and second chapters of this book should have been swapped. I feel like the second chapter does a way better job of introducing us to the world and the plot setup in a more understated and like understandable way. The first chapter in this book is like so much jargon and like discussion of these really intense technical concepts that will be important later in the book, without really letting us know why those concepts are going to be important, or letting us know why the character we're following in the first chapter is going to be important, or what the plot of this book is going to be about. And it just gives you kind of the wrong impression of what this book is going to be like. And then the second chapter immediately is like, all right, here's what we're doing, here are the characters, here's the world setup, and go. And then you're like, okay, here we go. So I really felt like those chapters should have been swapped, but once I got past that chapter, I had a really great time with this. I really liked this one. I again had to go out and buy a copy because I think the cover is so beautiful, and I really enjoyed this one. It is about this orphaned child who was adopted into this like space Romani-esque family, and it's really about, she's Black, and it's about her kind of struggles to really fit in among the Romani, being like a Black child adopted into this family, but also about the struggles of like living without a legal identity in a world where certain legal identities are privileged and prioritized. Sounds pretty close to our real reality, right? And in this book, we follow several different kinds of groups. We follow the, you know, corporations, which are majority white and rich, and then we also follow the union, which are majority Black, and then we also follow the travelers, which are Romani. And I really felt like this had a lot of intersectionality. Like, the other two main characters in this book who are introduced in the second chapter are an interracial gay couple. One of them is like a really low-level corporation person, and one of them is a Black union member. And their relationship, they really love each other, but they just have such this fundamental difference in like views of each other and values, and the kind of dimensions, again, the intersectionality of like being a white gay person versus being a Black gay person are really explored in this book. And then also the Black Romani character is also a lesbian, or like is kind of interested in her female best friend. So again, just a really great intersectional exploration of community and labor organization and the way that people organize their labor, and also a really great story about trying to find out what had happened to this main character's parents and trying to find her identity. And I did feel like all Melissa Scott books, it ends pretty abruptly, but unlike some Melissa Scott books, I did feel like the ending was really satisfying and like really nicely walked this like bittersweet line of like realistically dealing with like what would happen if these like three scrappy characters went up against this massive powerful corporation, and also like how this character is like trying to find her identity and like what will happen when she does find out her identity. And yeah, I really liked the ending of this one too, and I had a really good time with it, so I'll definitely reread this one in the future. I liked this a lot. Oh my god, when I was talking about the arcs, I totally forgot to talk about Thrall by Rebecca Mahoney. This is kind of a very, very vague Dracula retelling with Lucy Western Raw becoming Lucy Easting, and Jonathan and Mina Harker becoming John and Mila, the Demeter becoming a cruise ship. This was really fun. This is like a female-centric kind of Buffy-esque story about girls on a college campus tracking down and killing a vampire that has been kind of menacing the campus. It was very fun. The vampire in the story is very obviously like a metaphor for bodily autonomy and like sexual assault, and I thought it was really well done. I did kind of question the choice to bring in like the structural aspect of sexual assault on college campuses. Like the administration are explicitly aware that this vampire is like menacing isolated girls on campus, and they're letting him do it because he pays tuition and donates a lot of money, and in the end they only kill the vampire. They don't actually address any of like the people who were enabling him to do that, not even in like a token way where like they fire the one dean who's doing it but then another one comes in, or like not even in a way where they try to expose or try to kill the person enabling him but fail, like a bittersweet ending. No, it's just kind of like, and then we gave a lot of money to the administration so they would ignore the fact that we took away the other guy who was paying them a lot of money, and that just felt a little unsatisfying and disappointing to me. But overall, I really like this book. It focuses mainly on female friendships and female solidarity with like a very minor lesbian romance, and I thought this was a good fun time, and I do recommend this one when it comes out. And now it's time to gush about The Works of Vermin by Hiron Ennes and Leash by Hiron Ennes. I read both of these. I never buy books hardback, brand new books, but I really wanted to read this one, and I had a gift card, and I'm so glad I bought this because I just ended up absolutely loving this book. This reminded me of so many things I love. It reminded me of China Miéville, it reminded me of Seth Dickinson, it reminded me of Dishonored, it reminded me of Hollow Knight, it reminded me of Disco Elysium, of Perdido Street Station, of Vajrachandra of Alphabet of Thorn. Like, it reminded me of so many things that I love, but instead of feeling like messy and disjointed and like derivative, this story feels very well fleshed out and very unique and very coherent, and I just really loved everything about this story. Like, it felt like Perdido Street Station, but I immediately was just so much more interested in the characters and the world that felt a lot more manageable and important to me. Yeah, I loved the characters in this book. There is a toxic girl situationship and a toxic boy situationship. I love my toxic lesbians and toxic gays. This was reminding me of The Great Gatsby in one of the perspectives, because it's about like socialites and dealing with the social structures, and this one person who is like kind of content to be on the sidelines, and this one like glittering social figure and they have a really complicated friendship / romance, or is it? I loved the world building of this book. I loved the prose. It is interesting without going overboard. I love the themes around fascism and revolution and art. I loved one of the relationships in this book that is like catnip to me. It's like everything I love. It's these two characters who have been living together for a really long time, and you think it's gonna go one way, and then the relationship just like sours and curdles and goes a different way, and it really shows the kind of negative, toxic side of romantic love in a way that I really enjoyed, and didn't feel like preaching or like saying that gay love is evil or whatever, but just like showing the ways in which love can curdle and become possessive and toxic and really start to negatively impact people. There's also a great sibling relationship in this, multiple great sibling relationships in this. There's not a twist, but just like a reframing of the narrative that happens, and you could probably catch on earlier than I did, but I was an idiot and I didn't realize until like 80% of the way through the book what was actually going on, and then I was actually just gagged. Like, again, going completely blind, because I just loved putting the pieces together and being like, oh my god, that's what's been happening. And yeah, I wasn't even finished with this book, and I had already opened up the page to nominate it for the Le Guin Award. So that's how good this book was to me. And yeah, I just loved every aspect of it. I really, really loved this book. And I went then and read Hiron Ennes' debut novel, Leech, which is both very similar and very different. This one again is like very like high fantasy, creepy city, bug city, revolution and fascism in a city, whereas Leech is very much like Wuthering Heights meets The Thing and takes place in kind of like a steampunk-esque post-apocalyptic world. And I really liked Leech as well. It felt like it was a little bit less personally up my alley than Works of Vermin was, because I just loved everything about the setting and the characters and the way that the story was told. But I really liked Leech as well. It's a very interestingly told story in terms of framing and perspective, and I really liked the themes, the very present themes about like the white supremacist origins of the medical field and how like it is again based on these white supremacist ideals and the way that it treats not only the patients but also the practitioners who are not white and from the imperial core and able-bodied and rich and or upper middle class, and the way that that impacts people and the way they are dehumanized and treated as, you know, just a cog in the machine. I really enjoyed that aspect. And again, the setting takes place in like an isolated chateau in the mountains, very fun. And again, there's a very interesting thing going on with perspective. And I just want people to go into Leech like blind, not knowing anything like I did, and just experience this sort of shifting in perspective for themselves. So I'm not going to say too much, but just again, there's a really interesting thing where like slowly the way that things are framed by the narrative starts to change as something starts to happen to the main character. And I really enjoyed the way that that was done. I felt it was so subtle, so well done, so well integrated. And that's another thing I really liked about Leech and about Works of Vermin, but I feel like it was really exemplified in Leech, where it was just such a restrained and subtle story. So many authors, I feel like, especially modern fantasy authors, they info dump, they spoon feed you everything, and I don't like that. I like when there are things left up to your interpretation or things that the author doesn't hand to you, and Leech really did that, where like there's this huge world that you get glimpses of and all this like interesting stuff going on that you never learn about because that's not the point of the story. Like, we don't waste time info dumping on how the world got to the way it is now, where it's kind of this post-apocalyptic, like, again, steampunky-esque setting. We don't waste time explaining what the hell is up with these creepy twins who can seemingly like walk through walls and see ghosts. That's not important. That is not important to the narrative at hand, to the narrative we are exploring with the Institute and Emil. And we are focused on this very specific story, and anything that does not serve that very specific narrative is unimportant. And I loved that. I really loved it, and I felt like it made the narrative feel so tight and so well formed, and we end up in the narrative the same place that we started, and I loved that. I love the cyclical nature of it, especially because so much of the story is talking about like cycles of abuse and cycles of systemic oppression, and that was so well mirrored in the form of the book, and that's something I really love, when structure mirrors content. And yeah, the ending could be interpreted in so many different ways, and you could interpret it as like this very happy ending where they get away, or this ending where like, well, they made it for now, but let's see if this lasts. So I really loved Works of Vermin and Leech. I gave Works of Vermin 5 and Leech 4.5. I might bump that up because, again, as I'm talking about it, I am realizing how much I enjoyed Leech and how I thought it was a really well-crafted, well-constructed book. So I think I'm gonna give it a 5 actually. Or maybe a 4.75. I don't know. But yeah, so I really loved Works of Vermin, and it's weird to say because they only have 2 books out, but I really feel like Hiron Ennes has become like a new favorite of mine, kind of in that same sphere as like Bajra Chandrasekhara or Seth Dickinson, where like they don't actually have that many books published, which is like everything they've published I've really eaten up, and they're kind of part of this like modern fantasy sci-fi demographic that I feel like is still doing very unique and interesting things, both with prose but also with like storytelling structure, and I just eat it up and I have a really good time. Also, Yoon Ha Lee's in that group too. The Nebula shortlist got released in March, and I had already read like 4 out of 7 of the nominees, and so I just decided that I would read the 2 I hadn't read, and I'll talk about them very briefly in this video. I read 2, I'm still waiting for my Hold On one to come in. I'll talk about them very briefly in this video because I am going to make a full video going over like the Nebula novel, best novel nominees, and talk about them more in depth in that video. But I really liked Sour Cherry by Natalia Theodorodou. This is like vaguely a Bluebeard's wife retelling, but at its core it's kind of an exploration of domestic abuse and why women stay with domestic abusers, and it does really interesting things with like framing and narrative and perspective, which I enjoyed. It's kind of simultaneously the story of like this 21st century woman telling a story to her son as they're waiting for help to arrive, and also this like medieval Bluebeard's wife retelling, and you're never quite sure what details are crossing over, what is just this woman making up something for the story, and what is like drawn from her own life. And I really like that commentary on like stories, especially stories inspired by your own trauma. So what I did not like was When We Were Real by Daryl Gregory. This book was just not really my thing. It reminded me a little bit of Remember You Must Die by Eden Robbins, which was the only nominee I hated from the Le Guin Prize last year, in the sense that like it has a really interesting concept and then just kind of fails to execute that concept in a way that I enjoyed. The concept is so good. It's like 7 years ago, the world was revealed to be a simulation, and now this like terminally ill cancer patient and his best friend are like going on one last hurrah on like a bus trip to see all these like glitches in the system that have become like landmarks. And we meet this like wide cast of characters on the bus, and it's kind of supposed to be this very profound story about like humanity and living in a world that seemingly has no meaning. And you can really tell that this was probably inspired by the COVID pandemic, exposing like just how kind of fake our lives feel sometimes, and the kind of mass death and mass social change that came with that era, with that time period. However, I felt like this book really struggled to balance that like profound meaning of life story and the kind of subplot or main plot going on here about like a woman on the run from the government because she built an AI, and it ends with like this Matrix-esque like shootout battle, and I just felt like both of those themes did not go well together, and the book struggled to balance those two tones and those two aspects of it, and I didn't think it did either of them particularly well. It just ended up feeling like there were way too many people on the bus for us to actually explore all of their experiences and their ways of life, and there were multiple people on the bus who truly just feel totally irrelevant and feel like they don't add anything to the story. They get very little page time and perspective time, and that was really disappointing. This book is relentlessly heterosexual, despite the fact that neither of the heterosexual romances in this actually end up together. So I kind of have to give the story props for that, but like, what a waste of my time. What a waste of my time. I didn't like either of the romances, and then I also couldn't really connect to the central male friendship at the core of this book that is really trying to pull on your heartstrings and like make you very invested in it, because they spend so much time with their love interests instead. They also are very bro-y and act very annoying at times in a way that I think the book is thinks is charming and cute. Like, oh, look how incompetent my bros are, and I'm too much of a misandrist killjoy to think that that's funny or charming. Like, these guys are actively making like comic book references while they're rushing a pregnant teen girl to the hospital while she's giving birth. It's like, not the time, guys. Time and place. Not the time. And they're just generally incompetent in ways that I don't find charming, I find annoying. But yeah, where this book really pissed me off was at the end. It has kind of a tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow type vibe, where the book prioritizes raw emotion, raw, shocking, sudden emotion, than like actually having a good character arc for the characters. Like, the main character, JP, does not have a satisfying narrative arc where he like learns to take life as it comes even though he's dying, or like learns to try to struggle to live on even though the world seems meaningless. Just this kind of tragic thing happens to him, and then it abruptly changes how he feels about life because he's had this very sudden tragic thing happen to him. We don't actually see him grapple with that tragic thing happening or with the change that brings to his life. We just kind of skip forward a couple months into the future and he's learned all this stuff. It's like, I don't know if that's very satisfying to me. Yeah, so I didn't really enjoy this one. I gave this a 2.5. And this made me very scared because I was like, I don't know if I want to read the other nominees now. But then I read Sour Cherry and I liked it. So we'll see how I feel about the last one. And then I did it. I finally read Blood Communion by Anne Rice. So I am now completely done with the Vampire Chronicles. Can you believe it? I read all 12 books in the Vampire Chronicles. It took me years. Yeah, I felt like this book in particular, it wasn't really a great ending to this series plot-wise. I felt like Prince Lestat was actually a much better like conclusion for this series plot-wise, in terms of like getting the gang together and like having them face this big threat. In this one, the plot feels quite small and quite unfinished. Like, I kept expecting the entire book for there to be some sort of twist. Like, it felt like the plot was supposed to be that this new vampire, Santh, was like the bad guy and was behind it the whole time and like convinced Rashomon to like do all the stuff he does. But no, turns out by the end of the book he's just this cool new vampire, and Rashomon just chose to do all that stuff for no reason, which really disappointed me because Rashomon was one of the characters I really liked in the other two Prince Lestat books, and I really liked Benedict too in their relationship. And just again in this book, they both just are like, well, time to kill myself. It's like, what? Okay. Why are you doing that though? I don't get it. And yeah, and again, the plot in this one is so like undone. It's just like, all right, these characters decide to do this stuff for no reason, then we very quickly solve what they've done, and then the book is over. However, I did kind of find the ending of this book sweet in the thematic sense. Like, the whole ending of this book is like all the vampires getting together and like building this beautiful community for themselves, and like Lestat being like, yeah, see, we can have like a healthy, loving lifestyle and community together. It doesn't matter that we're vampires. And like, you can really tell that like Anne Rice's opinions changed over like the 40 years she was writing this series. Like, vampires went from an exploration of her own grief and trauma to like kind of just a metaphor for like anybody who is an outsider or who feels like they don't belong in society, especially as the fame of the books meant that she was surrounded by a crowd of like-minded young fans. So it's like, I think it's really sweet actually that she decided she wanted the takeaway of this series to be that like, you are not a monster, you're not inherently evil, even if society doesn't understand you, and you can find happiness and joy and love and a community of people who will feel the same way as you and will support you. Like, that's sweet. It made me chuckle a little bit, it made me smile. So yeah, as an actual book, I didn't love this. And as a conclusion to this series, again, it's not the greatest. I really do prefer Prince Lestat and the Realms of Atlantis, which is crazy. How are you having me say that the Atlantis book with aliens is better than this? But as a thematic conclusion to this series, again, I do find it quite sweet and quite a good way to wrap up the Vampire Chronicles. So finally, we are done with my March wrap-up. Those are the books I wanted to talk about of the books I read in March. And again, it was a great month. I read a lot of really interesting arcs, even if I didn't love them. And I found a new favorite author and read a lot of great books. So thank you for watching this video. Let me know if you've read any of these books, how you feel about them, if you have any recommendations for what I should read in April, and if any of those videos ideas I mentioned sound interesting to you. And yeah, thank you, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!